This is Professor Miller again, and I am back with another video lecture. This one is on Edgar Allan Poe and his Tales of Dread. All right, well, let's get the slideshow going. So this one is meant to be watched with the video screen set so that you can see my screen in the background and with my face in the lower right corner. So use those buttons on top of the screen to adjust your settings so that my face is in the lower right corner and the majority of the screen is occupied by the slideshow. Either that or just get rid of my face and listen to my voice while you watch the lecture. All right, so here we go. Edgar Allan Poe. Many of you have probably heard of Edgar Allan Poe. He's one of the most famous American writers. He's a classic. He's been around since, well, he was born in 1809. He died in 1849, so he's been around for well over 150 years. He's an iconic American writer. He's been famous since his very earliest published stories, and he's best known for both his stories and his poems like The Raven. He's widely regarded as a Central American figure in the movement known as Romanticism. You may not think of the dark and dreary Edgar Allan Poe as a romantic, but on the shadow side of Romanticism, so to speak, we find writers like Poe exploring the Gothic. And as I mentioned in the lecture video talking about Hawthorne, the Gothic is what happens to the romantic imagination when it pushes through all the mysteries that it's curious about and explores the other side and realizes that there's nothing there or that what's there is darkness. Poe is, in a sense, the quintessential American writer of the Gothic. He's widely regarded then as the first writer to have created not one, but almost two, one and a half genres. The genre he definitely created, almost everyone gives him credit for this, is detective fiction. Detective fiction, of course, is incredibly popular today. There's all kinds of detective stories, but it's also popular in television and film. I don't know if any of you are fans of procedural crime dramas, but those are a form of detective fiction. The earliest and most famous example of detective fiction are the stories of Arthur Conan Doyle about Sherlock Holmes, who is still being remade into movies and films. Well, Poe precedes those. Poe came up with the idea of detective-based stories much earlier in a story called The Purloined Letter. The Purloined Letter, however, doesn't have any magic in it, so it's not going to be in this class. It doesn't really fit the focus. Oh, the second genre, I almost skipped it. The second genre, he also helped contribute to the development of science fiction. So, he was born in Boston, and he was the son of two traveling actors who led a tragic life. It was difficult to be the son of traveling actors. In his day, this was an occupation only held by people on the margins of society. To be a traveling actor meant not to have a home of your own, not to have a stable family. These were people that went from town to town entertaining, and this sort of migrant lifestyle affected Poe, and it didn't give him a stable sense of self or a sense of belonging. What's more, his father abandoned the family in 1810, and his mother died the following year. These tragedies had a terrible impact on young Poe. Orphaned, he was adopted by John and Frances Allan, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. Although they never formally adopted him, they took care of him well into his young adulthood and saw him begin his college there in Virginia. But disputes over gambling, his inability to hold down a steady job, and his desire to be a writer more than a student led him to quit college and seek his fortune as a young bachelor, soon moving to New York City, where he lived in an inexpensive flat and squeaked by a living publishing stories and other pieces in newspapers and magazines. He fell in love with and married his very young cousin. She was actually 13 years old when they married, which was young then, although not as young as it seems now. It wasn't a crime then. Virginia, he really was in love with her, and it was legal to marry a person that young then. It was somewhat uncommon, but not that uncommon. Average marriage ages were often around 15 or 16, so make of that what you will. It certainly doesn't fit with my own personal notions of a proper marriage, but times have changed. Um, if that makes you feel a little bit icky about Poe, I guess I understand. It seems to not so much the youth of it, but the marriage itself and his own romantic nature made him feel that way too, because, well, tragically, she died of tuberculosis just 2 years after their marriage, and they were still in what you might call the honeymoon period. It seems weird saying that about a couple where one's an adult and the other is, by our standards, a child, but I guess that's what they thought of it like. They were truly and deeply in love. I mean, every bit of evidence suggests that. And when she died at that young age, tuberculosis is a lung disease. It was called consumption back then. When she died at that young age, it absolutely devastated him. And he wrote all these terribly mournful poems, often about the beautiful young women dying young. And that really kind of took over his creative life for a long time. Some of these poems were quite moving, and they made him popular. They made him famous. Poe himself died in 1849 at the age of 40. The cause of his death is not known. It's widely believed to have been caused by his drinking habits. He basically seems to have drank himself to death, although the specific nature of his illness isn't really known. Could have been cholera. Some people believed he was a drug abuser, and it could have been a byproduct of his use of opium. Others believe it was rabies. Some even think that he committed suicide by drinking. Tuberculosis has also been suggested as another cause. So why is Poe important? Well, Poe was the first American writer to make a living solely from publishing stories and poems. The others who came before him had other sources of income, like giving speeches, for example, or in the case of Irving, being an actual diplomat for the United States government. But Edgar Allan Poe, coming from a relatively poor family and one where his parents both died young, really needed to make a living from his writing, whereas some of these others really did not. So he gets a lot of credit for that. During his own era, he was better known as more of a critic than he was a fiction writer, and he published a lot of very harsh, very caustic book reviews of other poets and short story writers that gave him a reputation as a hatchet man. Hatchet man's like a term for somebody who chops down the reputations of other writers. He also invented genres. I mentioned that he invented detective fiction earlier, but here what we're more interested in is the invention of a kind of American style of Gothic, which he kind of co-invented with Hawthorne. I mentioned the Gothic in relation to Hawthorne earlier, but here the Gothic is a particularly dark and gloomy style, more like Bram Stoker's Dracula. His writing was beloved in Europe. His poetry was actually loved more in countries like France than it was in the United States. He apparently translates very well. I'm much more of a fan of his fiction than his poems myself. I find the musicality in his poems to be a bit much. One critic described the music of his poetry as like wearing a diamond on each finger, meaning that it was too rich, too dense, too musical, too sing-songy. Emerson referred to Poe as the jingle jangle man, talking about his poems, insulting his poems. I tend to agree. I find the poems difficult to get through because they're so repetitious and insistent in their repetitious musicality. But his stories I like. His stories have dread and mystery and wonder, and they've, haunted the nightmares of many a teenager and young person, and they still do. What else about Poe should you know? Well, the first story we'll read by Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher, was published in 1839. This is a work of Gothic fiction, and it includes themes of madness, family isolation, and metaphysical identities. As with Hawthorne, the magic in the story is dark and the meaning allegorical. That means you have to read between the lines to get at what he's meaning. Everything in the story has some kind of symbolic or allegorical value. The paintings, the house, the conversations, the names that are mentioned. So it won't be likely that you read too deeply into this story. The haunted house tale is a familiar one, but it wasn't as familiar when Poe wrote it. Poe contributed to the haunted house genre. a genre that's been taken up subsequently by many, including today many horror movie makers. Also, like Hawthorne, Poe was interested in the theme of purity and corruption, how a little corruption can corrupt, absolutely. The background for the fall of the House of Usher is interesting. Poe's inspiration for the story seems to have been based upon events of a house known as the Hezekiah Usher House, which was located on an estate in a 3-block area in modern Boston. The house was constructed in 1684 and was either toned down or relocated in 1830. Newspaper sources indicate that a sailor and his young wife, his sailor and the young wife of an older owner of the house were caught and entombed while having an affair by her husband. When the Usher house was torn down or moved in 1830, it's not known, the two bodies were found embraced in a cavity in the cellar. And this romantic and dark story of love gone wrong formed the basis for Poe's story. A critic named G.R. Thompson wrote that this story has long been hailed as a masterpiece of Gothic horror. It's also a masterpiece of dramatic irony and structural symbolism. Irony is when you say one thing and mean another. And symbolism, I think you know what that means. See if you can catch instances of irony and symbolism as you read the story. The second story we'll read by Poe is called The Masque of the Red Death. A masque is an archaic, old-fashioned word for a formal party. Many masques were costume parties, as is the case here. This is another story about corruption and, in this case, repression. The repression and evil in Poe always go hand in hand. Evil finds a way to triumph in his stories. Evil seems more powerful than good, at least in the hands of fallible humans. The victory of evil is sweetest when it's a victory over hypocrites, as in this story. Poe loved attacking European social elite. In part, this was a marketing scheme because many Americans really didn't like Europeans that much, who they felt looked down on them. Then, as now, Americans had a populist streak which made them resent the elites. Poe, like a certain contemporary politician, took advantage of this suspicion of elites. And this is one of those stories. This is one where the corrupt and sinful, decadent elites of this formal party meet their doom, so to speak. This isn't a political story, though, but a moral one. The theme of disease, which also marks the story, was a powerful one in Poe's day because the memory of plagues and the threat of dying from mass disease was very much on people's minds. The third and final story that I'll talk about in this video, and the last one in Module 1, is The Telltale Heart. One of the most widely retold and represented stories ever. The Telltale Heart has become movies, it's become cartoons. It was retold in The Simpsons. There is a version of it in a SpongeBob SquarePants cartoon. There have been full feature-length films of it. There have been children's comic books of it. There have been long versions of it for adults. This is one of his most famous stories. And it's a story about narration, about a narrator. It all comes from within the mind of this narrator. It uses the strategy of unreliable narration. The exactness with which the narrator recounts the murdering of an old man, as if his stealthy, sneaky ways amounted to a kind of perfect crime, amounted to an execution that one could take pride in, reveal the monomania and paranoia of the speaker little by little as readers realize his evil nature. The focus of the story is a perverse scheme. It's a scheme to commit the perfect crime. And this kind of perfect crime story has become a major trope in Hollywood movies. You could probably think of a perfect crime movie or two yourself. I'm thinking of The Usual Suspects right off the bat. It's the first one that comes to mind for me. The focus in this story on the theme of the perverse, on a kind of perverse scheme, also influenced detective fiction. Even though this isn't really about a detective, that idea of the perfect crime became a part of that genre. And the narrator of The Telltale Heart while generally assumed to be a man, it's important to note could be a woman. Poe never names or gives a gender to the narrator through a pronoun, like he or she, so we can only guess. Most readers, I think, assume that the narrator is a man, but try reading the story with the idea of it being a woman, and you'll find that it works just as well. This story, like The Fall of the House of Usher and the main character Roderick Usher, portrays someone who suffers from something known as hypersensitivity. Hypersensitivity is an old-fashioned 19th century word for what we today might call paranoia. If the condition of these two characters is true, what these hypersensitives may hear, especially, let's talk about this one, about in The Telltale Heart, what they may hear may not be what it seems. The narrator in The Telltale Heart first admits to hearing beetles in the wall after startling the old man from his sleep. And according to superstition, these beetles, they're called Death Watch beetles, that's their actual name, were a sign of impending death. One variety of Death Watch beetle raps its head against surfaces. I'm told this is, I guess, a beetle mating ritual, while others emit a kind of ticking sound. Henry David Thoreau, the famous nature writer, observed in an 1838 article that Death Watch beetles make sounds very similar to a human heartbeat. This may have given Poe the idea for the story. Poe's stories identify psychological phenomenon analyzed later by Freud before Freud gave a name to it. He analyzes subsubjects as repression, schizophrenia, paranoia, projection, and split personalities. Poe's use of magic, like Hawthorne's, is dark, always dark. The poet Richard Wilbur suggested that The Telltale Heart is an allegorical representation of a Poe poem called To Science, which depicts a struggle between the imagination and science. In this reading, The Telltale Heart, the old man may represent the scientific and rational mind, while the narrator may stand for the imaginative. Well, that's it for this video on Edgar Allan Poe. I hope it helps you to get a little more out of these stories. And I'll be checking back in with an introduction to Module 2, so I will see you soon.